Dr. Dean St.Mart, renowned for his knowledge of bodybuilding pharmacology, PhD in synthetic chemistry, and product formulator for supplement needs. He is a renowned pharmacologist for his no-nonsense approach and open-ended transparency in bodybuilding and the dangers associated.
Every step you take is either going to lead you towards ease or towards dis-ease. You could make it where enante fits better over cypionate. Those genetic changes could dictate whether you're a good responder to a certain ester drug regardless. The fast or slow metabolizer we covered comes from liver genetics, the CYPs. Guys in the 90s were basically, well, if he's taking 4 vials of parabolan, I'm going to do 5.
What's the craziest thing you've heard in terms of abuse?
10 plus grams of testosterone. For one thing, you sort of applaud, well, where did you find space to inject that volume? But on the other side, you have a spillover. Like when you're trying to carb up for a show, you've got a sweet spot where you're going to have glycogen build within your muscle tissue without the excess water retention. Where the spillover then is interacting with aromatase, interacting with 5-alpha reductase, oxidative stress. I hate using the phrase cosmetic compound, but it almost changes how fluid is distributed into your skin cells. When you're very low body fat, when you add it in, how your skin changes, a rougher texture to your skin, but it's the fact that the skin is actually not as hydrated as it normally would be, and you sort of then see very dry striations, especially around the chest, shoulders. What happens with orals is they can potentially interfere with how bile is made within the liver, and then obviously bile is stored in the gallbladder. And a lot of the digestive upset with orals, how we sort of try and offset that then is by improving bile viscosity, so TUDCA or UDCA, and then maybe using, if you're on a certain dose for a longer period of time and now it's not yielding a benefit, sometimes it can be a lifestyle that's impacting how you gain muscle mass, where you're not sleeping properly, bile flow, acid health, digestion slows down. Indirectly can come from the drugs themselves, where taking a break naturally resolves some of that roadblock, and now all of a sudden.
How you doing, brother? You look fucking badass with that on you.
Well, I'd say 9 days ago I wasn't in the same condition as I am now, and then a week before that, I guess we're lucky with what we have with medicine to be able to get something fixed so quickly.
Yeah.
But I knew as soon as I got punched in the face, I knew my nose was broke. It was like, it wasn't even one of those ones where you ask someone, oh, is my nose broke? You just felt my nose was over here.
Fuck.
So,
yeah, that's rough. I
was lucky in that whatever way it broke, all the blood started going down the back of my throat rather than all over the mats. And so that was a lot easier to manage trying to get to hospital with, not trying to stop blood pissing out my face.
Oh God. That's fucking hardcore. Bro,
well, yeah, there was a doctor at the event. So yeah, for people who didn't know, I decided to return to martial arts after 11 years with my brother. And we
win a fucking championship.
I went to the WKA World Championship. So my brother is a very successful kickboxer. We introduced him at a very early age. Like growing up, I done karate, and then I sort of left martial arts. And then my brother convinced me when we put him into kickboxing at 10 to go back to kickboxing as a martial art. I done it on and off, and then sort of left in, I can't even remember now the year. I think it must have been 2012, 2011 to do bodybuilding. I had smashed my ankle training prior to that. That was the whole thing that got me into bodybuilding, was kickboxing. And so with no sort of plans now, finishing competing, still training, my brother was sort of at me of, you should come back to kickboxing. And like in your head, you're thinking, well, I've got no goal. When you've got no physique goal to speak, you're like, well, what challenge can I put on myself to train for? So why not go back to martial arts where it all began? So
right, that's badass, dude.
Yeah, I mean, it was fun up until like there was 20 seconds left in the final, I should say, and I dodged a kick, went into counter with a punch to the guy's stomach, and I just felt this fist come across my face in counter from my punch to his stomach, and. Yeah, we knew straight away. Like, I just looked at the ref. The ref ended up calling the match and disqualifying the other guy because it wasn't full contact. Like, had I have went into full contact and got my nose broke, I could have said, oh, well, it's on me for that happening. But it was just annoying because that just then put me into A&E and the hospital, and then having to figure out with the ENT. One of the biggest risks when you break your nose is if your septum in the middle gets a hematoma, you're at big risk of like your septum dying, basically. So your septum's made of cartilage, and there's not very good blood flow to it. So if it fills with a hematoma, it can starve itself of nutrient delivery. So I sort of knew this from years ago, but when you're in the sort of moment of it, you're not really thinking about it. And the event doctor said to my brother when we were getting ready to leave the event to go to A&E, he was like to my brother, don't tell him, but there's a risk here that he needs to be seen ASAP for a CT scan to make sure he doesn't have a septum hematoma, or how badly it was sort of broken across. And afterwards, when the CT scan came back clear, my brother said to me, you know, all afternoon after the doctor said it to me, that was like the biggest risk in my head, that I'm thinking, God, if he only knows what he's potentially at risk of without even realizing. But it's like, it's one of those things that I've gotten injured in the past, I've gotten hurt. You just have to accept the situation for what it is and just pray that you're going to get seen to quite quickly an accident and emergency. And, you know, hats off in Sheffield, where we're in the UK. What was funny was we turned up to the doctor at the event said to us, there's a local hospital that has, you know, a minor injuries unit. If there's any hospital you want to get injured, it's to go to that one, Hallamshire Royal Hospital. We turned up. It took a 15-minute Uber to get to this hospital. We walk in at 6 p.m. and the receptionist says, oh, this minor injuries clinic closes at 8 p.m. And we were like, so what happens if it gets to 8 p.m? Oh, we just close and you're sent home. And I'm like looking and I'm going, what? And she's like, yeah, X-ray, everywhere here closes 8 p.m. We won't be able to do anything until tomorrow. I said, well, is there another accident and emergency? And she said, oh yeah, Sheffield, Northern General Hospital is another 15-minute Uber. That has an A&E that's open 24 hours. So hopped in another Uber. So like we're wasting time here trying to get to the hospital. So yeah, thankfully when we got to the hospital within 2 hours, they had the CT scan done. They were fairly confident that the CT was clear, but because we flew over, I didn't even know if I could fly back on a plane, that maybe I'd have to stay in the UK to have the sort of surgery with the NHS. NHS consultant came after staying in hospital overnight on the Friday, and he basically came to me Saturday morning and he said, you know, normally if that had occurred and I was present as a consultant and I had a good confidence level that was just like a break, a comminuted break across, you could quickly push it back in place. But he said if it's not done immediately, then you have to wait 4 or 5 days for the inflammation to settle, to go in and break it back into place. So yeah, I mean, I had on my social media, like I said, some of these injuries are going to happen to us in life. I ended up in an ENT ward that evening after I was waiting to see that consultant to be allowed to fly home. And I was in a ward with 3 other guys. And obviously by the time they admitted me into the hospital, it was like 12:30 at night, after midnight. The 3 guys in the room are asleep. And so the next morning I got talking to one of the gentlemen. He was in his 80s. And like he then turns around to me and says, oh, we're all in here waiting on cancer treatment. And that, you know, puts things into perspective, that your nose break isn't the biggest problem in the room, that there's three guys there who are receiving, you know, quite serious treatment and care, that it really then makes you, you know, it was very somber. I got talking to this guy, he was telling me he travelled to Northern Ireland, he knew, you know, where we live and everything. And then at 3 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, by the time they ran bloods to check that I'd lost a lot of blood, so they wanted to make sure that I was okay to be discharged. By the time the blood results came back and I was allowed to leave the hospital, you know, reflecting on saying goodbye to these guys in this ward who are, you know, undergoing like throat cancer, therapies, that you really then put things into perspective, how grateful you are that although you've had like a, you know, shit accident, in the bigger universe, in the scheme of things, that your problem is probably relatively small to someone else's. So that, that's been a good lesson to help reframe and remind you that whilst things happen to you, a lot of worse things happen to other people.
Yeah. Yeah, the reframing is extremely important. Something that I appreciate whenever my family and I travel to the Philippines about every other year when I was a child, because that's not really a perspective that most kids get, I guess. So
I'm sure it's always nice to like travel back home. Like, obviously my father's from Mauritius, so we've traveled to Mauritius a couple of times, and that again reframes how different sort of the Western world is versus what happens in other cultures and countries. That we traveled there 2 years ago in 2023, and the last time I was there prior to that was like 2005. And so the difference in those 18 years of what sort of happened culturally shows that obviously that sort of developing side of the world is catching up very quickly. But it reframes everything, the comforts that we have at home versus what other countries may not have as quickly developed as us.
Yeah, right.
Combat sports have some level of need to satisfy aggression. I guess that's sort of where, when I moved from kickboxing into bodybuilding, the aggression was against a piece of equipment in the gym rather than someone on the mats with you. And that's but there has to be, like with weightlifting and bodybuilding, there's a place for controlled aggression, and then there's a place for where you leave it behind. And that's what I loved with the beauty of bodybuilding, was you could go in the gym and you could effectively take out frustrations on a piece of equipment based on what your logbook is saying you have to beat. But it's important that what's said and done in the gym is left behind, that you don't carry that aggressive behavior out of the gym environment.
Right. Yeah. I bet it's super interesting now too, though, that you've been delving into this space for, what is it called? The Enhanced games?
Yeah.
Has there been any like evolution in that since the last time we spoke?
Not really. I've stepped away a little bit from it in terms of like my advisory position. I've had too much going on. Dr. Imran Khan and Dr. Guillermo Escalante are still involved. To my knowledge, from the inside out, there is still a lot of discussion going on surrounding, I guess, what is a fair protocol to use. And like we highlighted in the last conversation, I find it just very difficult to frame the word safety, because, to be honest, if you're putting like safe protocols in place, we know bodybuilding, none of this is safe. And it'd be silly to try and portray it as safe. Like we're looking at it at a responsible level. We're competing in a responsible fashion. With that in mind, would someone's risk threshold be lower than another's? Yeah, of course. But, I think one of the main arguments I brought up last year in Oxford was how do you define one man's success could be poisonous, but are they going to care? If we're setting world records that have never been achieved by athletes, like the whole, if you won a gold medal at the Olympics and you died in 5 years, would you take the medal? A lot of this is setting history, whilst it's tainted a little bit, and I don't really agree with it. When you look at when they done the public event, or like the launch of the games in Las Vegas back in the summer, and they done the sprint record for swimming, even trying to like sift through what a lot of mainstream media were doing, even in Ireland it was on the radio, where it was sort of being tainted that, oh yeah, but that was with drug use. It's like that stigma of how we approach like hormone optimization and discussions like that I'm not sure why the angle is there. Maybe it's from a level of people going out and doing silly things based on what they see. And again, that was another fair criticism I brought up of one of the ethics of the Enhanced Games is whatever they whatever they do with the athletes will be publicly made available. So in terms of the protocols they run, one of the things I was hinged on was transparency of information. So if whatever swimmer takes whatever protocol and achieves a world record, this is what they done. There's transparency rather than trying to mask it behind coaching practices and training, which isn't a takeaway from that being a positive driver of someone's success.
Right. But still an important facet, but
like,
in the past, people would just avoid talking about it altogether.
Yeah. And so one of the things with the Enhanced Games was to be like critically transparent in, I guess one of their end goals is like human evolution. I don't think we sort of touched on that in the last conversation, but it's like transhumanism of how we evolve the species really is, one of their overarching goals. And even when you look at Enhanced Games, I was part of a discussion panel in Oxford when we were having this sort of conference with all the experts. And enhancement can mean external enhancements versus like internal, what you put in your body, like drugs or peptides or whatever. Like external enhancements can be like bionics. So, we're heading into a slippery slope here of like, one of the things that was in their charter was you couldn't like, you couldn't create any form of, I guess you could say like humiliation of your body, where you could not go in and like chop your leg off to get a robotic leg for the aspect of performance enhancement. That's like viewed morally and ethically wrong. But, for releasing data where someone has an exoskeleton or whatever, slowly over time, people are crazy. They'll do crazy things. You have to be very careful on what you're promoting with that transparency of information. So I've sort of stepped away. Dr. Dan Turner is obviously the lead when it comes to the Athlete Safety Committee. He might be someone very interesting to get on the podcast.
Okay. What did you say his name was again?
Dan Turner, Dr. Dan Turner.
Dr. Dan Turner. Okay, gotcha.
He'd be obviously, he's like the lead on strategy for athlete safety. So he'd be someone very interesting. I've had good conversations with him prior to Oxford and in Oxford on where they're sort of standing now. Because obviously we're heading into now nearly the start of 2026. Like before we know it, I think May or June is when they have the first like set of games planned for in Las Vegas. It's not going to be long coming round.
Wow. Wild. That's going to be insane. The bionics thing is extremely interesting because that's something that I remember when I was watching Teen Titans as a teenager, and I'm like, honestly, I want to get in bionics. And literally the reason I'm in California is because I was going to do my master's in biomechanical engineering at UCSD. And instead, I just decided to put the substances in myself, try to make myself a I mean, that would be insane. Just a, I don't know. I can't even fathom the thought of like, how would you standardize that?
Yeah, I mean, how I brought it up, like, well, it wasn't actually me that brought up the discussion. It was, I forget his name now. I'm very bad with remembering names, but he was one of the heads of WADA for doping control, for blood doping, an Australian guy. Apologies, I can't remember your name, but we were on this expert panel together, and he brought up the aspects of, breaking world records wearing external enhancements. And I never even thought about it, but like running shoes is an external enhancement. Like when you look at runners and the science that goes into runners, it's incredible. Like, naively, I wasn't even thinking of this. He was on about, like running suits, runners, goggles, etc. And then it sort of slowly led into, transhumanism of like, I brought up the aspect of like artery with, we already have, Neuralink and other technologies coming out that eventually have like an artificial AI retina where like your eye is replaced, where like, if you're doing archery or shooting, it's telling you, move your hand 2 degrees left and now fire. does that, take away the element of like marksmanship then, where you have to actually train, hand-eye coordination to shoot a gun, and you've got a piece of tech sitting inside your eyeball that's telling you how to shoot perfectly. We're sort of laughing at it and think this is all science fiction, and probably, back in like the 70s and 80s would have been, that sort of very Terminator-esque.
Right. Yeah, but it's totally possible.
The way things are progressing with AI in terms of how AI is thinking and returning information, it's something that I've watched closely in terms of like what is AI capable of doing when you try and set the limits. If you let it run unhinged, even medically, what will it, I guess, return back as a source of information? I guess it's when you use like some of the thinking models within OpenAI and ChatGPT, it's very responsible in how it returns information. And I think that might have been a new update, to be honest, in terms of how it thinks now. That prior with ChatGPT, you could coax some things out of it, hypothetically, and now it will only hinge off strict guidelines and will cite the strict guideline references, which is a good thing, because then it means that there's some level of accountability to the information it's gathering. But then it sort of questions you, well, something like that in terms of gatekeeping, an honest discussion, it's being biased a little bit. But on the other side, having clear established rules, overcomes hopefully some of the safety concerns, because obviously when you look at some of the inventors of the technology speaking on, podcasts, security and how this is capable of evolving is quite scary when you think about it.
Yeah, scary and freaking epic.
yeah. On two sides, 100%. It's almost like that Terminator-esque side of, you don't want to get to the point where the machines think they can take over then.
Yeah. Speaking of standardizing, though, all of this, including the enhanced games, I love that last time, especially in the first podcast, we discussed slow versus fast metabolizers and respective steroid doses, and which was widely loved by the audience and myself too, because I think it's something that hasn't been stated very often, or at least expounded on in the past, because there's just this like very easy, this common perception that if you take more doses, or if you take higher doses, then you're going to have a one-up on your competition. But we each have our own, I'd say, potential sweet spot, depending on what the drawbacks are. And obviously these drawbacks are in variance depending on what our genetics are as well. So it's definitely like a game of like shooting a dart in the dark, unless maybe you get your genetics tested or whatever. But I mean, getting the data that we've been doing personally, which all of us have been doing as bodybuilders, or even coaches, you could say, have been doing with their clients, is probably the most important part. But I also appreciate that we talked about oxidative stress being a primary driver of a lot of these diseases. And that's why real bodybuilding, like eating healthy, sleep, rest, cardio, etc., is a whole lifestyle that includes healthy habits done consistently that most people don't do consistently. And now finally the industry is openly talking and discussing supplementation, longevity interventions, and blood work, and a bunch of scans and everything that's important. So I think we're definitely evolving, especially with bodybuilding, which I think is a beautiful thing, because, back then in the 90s, you'll hear stories of the guys just taking all the stacks that they got from their coaches, never getting their blood work done ever, bro. And it blows my mind that like even some of these guys are still alive today, but obviously not in the greatest condition. So imagine that we're doing all of these inventions, all of these oxidative stress interventions. I just feel like, I don't know, man. I feel like unless we're dealt with some pretty shitty genetics, we should be okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely turning into a more open discussion of risk tolerance. But now that risk tolerance isn't like any, mini, miny, mo of let's just keep upping the dose until side effects, whether they're physical, mental, I guess biological, towards digestion, etc. We're now at a place where we can probably use genetics, so we can use some level of genomics, which is basically using your genetics to understand how pharmacology interacts in your body. And like we then have to view pharmacology as two branches. We've got pharmacokinetics of how the drug basically moves through the body between administration all the way to elimination.
Right.
But on the other side, you've got pharmacodynamics, which is basically how does the drug interact in your body, at a receptor level? How does it how does it bind? How does it create changes in your genome or cellularly? And so,
like, the first one's like how your body interacts with how your body changes or interacts with the drug, and then the second one's like how the drug interacts and changes with your body, right?
Correct. So like when you sort of look at, let's take injectable testosterone, because an injectable testosterone versus an oral steroid will have two different pharmacokinetics. So when you inject something, you are bypassing the sort of gut first pass of having to absorb something, from the stomach into the intestine, and from the intestine to the liver, and then from the liver out into systemic circulation. With an injectable, you've got ADME, which is like the acronym for pharmacokinetics, and that's administration, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. And what some people actually then say between, administration, you've got absorption occurring afterwards. So really, it's like administration, liberation, distribution, metabolism, excretion. You administer the drug, it's liberated, it's distributed through your tissues, throughout all your body. It's then metabolized by the liver for either secondary metabolic effects or for excretion, making it more easier for your body to get rid of in your urine or feces. Genetically, for something like an injectable testosterone, you've got the ester attached. So now you've got maybe genetics in terms of how do you cleave that ester away? So one of the main esters, or esterases, the enzymes that take the ester away, is PDE7B, phosphodiesterase 7B. Dr. Scott Stevenson has done some lovely podcasts on this if people sort of search for it with Think Big. But with PDE7B, we have to view enzymes have a 3D shape in terms of how our body makes them. We have the genetics, which is the recipe, and now you have the translation of the recipe into the protein. With PD7B, this is sort of what my contextualization of it is, why some people respond better to enanthate versus cypionate. This whole age-old argument of, what testosterone ester is better between cypionate and enanthate. Cypionate has a 5-membered ring. It's big and bulky. Enanthate has a long carbon chain, and it can rotate in space, and it's very flexible. If you've got an enzyme, PD7B, which is going to cleave that ester away to leave you with the parent testosterone. So when you inject testosterone enanthate, you're taking it for the parent testosterone, and then the ester is just cleaved off and metabolized. PD7B, because it's got that 3D conformation, you could make it in a certain shape where enanthate fits better over cypionate. And now you've got either faster ester clearance, so the ester is being cleaved off quicker, and you're sending the drug into circulation, the testosterone from the depot into circulation, or it's slower and it's causing post-injection pain, where the ester is sitting in that depot of the skin. With that in mind, those genetic changes could dictate, whether you're a good responder to a certain ester, drug regardless. So then you've got, obviously, the parent compound is cleaved after the ester. So the ester is one element of pharmacokinetics. The injection depot has some level of pharmacokinetics as well, of where you inject the ester. So whether it's the delt, the glute.
Right, delt or the glute, right.
We're going to have different distribution speeds. And that's based on like the fat content and how basically when you inject an oily depot, it spreads out along the fibers, or in theory, that's what should happen. It should spread out along the fibers. If it's sort of localized and just sits as a big bolus, then the drug delivery might actually be a little bit slower than spreading out over a larger surface area when you create that injection depot.
I thought I saw some graphs stating that doing injections in the glute seemed to be more optimal in terms of like absorption, like overall absorption, and
there's a good
out of the drug.
There is a good study that looked at, I believe it was at nandrolone, I think. Now you're putting me on the spot. And it looked at the absorption, well, the serum plasma level that was achieved, or the area under the curve, with different injection sites. It was either nandrolone or testosterone. I'll look up the study. I can send a link to you afterwards. But yeah, there was clear, distinct changes in how the drug was distributed into the body based on where it was injected. Now, bear in mind, I think, again, from off the top of my head, knowledge-wise, whilst there was differences between, say, the delt and the glute, statistically it was quite small in terms of the change that, one is more optimal than the other, but in the bigger scheme of things, compliance is the bigger thing that drives how a drug is administered to someone, whether it's easier for it to put a needle in the glute or to put a needle in the delt, whatever their sort of flexibility allows. Some people might prefer to do a delt IM shot over a glute shot, but then we have to bear in mind that there's probably a lot more fat tissue within the glute than the delt. So again, the absorption speed from the delt is normally viewed faster than the glute because of the depot that's formed in the glute.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'll send a paper on this. It's been a while since I read that paper. But, that of itself adds a layer of adding on to your genetics and of how quickly the drug is released for it to interact with esterases as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, as soon as that parent drug is released into the bloodstream, you're now looking at it's being distributed through the body. So you've got like your volume of distribution, how the drug is being put out into circulation, whether that's on carrier proteins like albumin or sex hormone binding globulin, or as free testosterone. We have to view, obviously, SHBG is linked to genetics to an extent and your liver health. Albumin is linked to your liver and kidney health. They're going to interfere with your free testosterone depending on how much is being made. So again, it's a layer of genetics. And then you've got, obviously, the free hormone testosterone either permeating into cells to interact with an androgen receptor, interact with aromatase, interact with 5-alpha reductase, or interact with a CYP metabolic enzyme that breaks it down, or a hydroxylase, or whatever sort of sulfation or glucuronidation, or whatever enzyme it interferes with or interacts with, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to see a change that drug's distribution as well, in terms of what you expect to get from X amount of dose of testosterone to what's actually yielded in serum. So I guess if you know your genetics and you've delved into, your CYP enzymes, how well or how heavy do you express CYP19A, which is aromatase? How much CYP3A4 you make, which is one of the main oxidation enzymes that breaks down testosterone? Your distribution of 5-alpha reductase versus 5-alpha or 5-beta reductase, the other converting enzyme. You could probably, assess based on like your natural blood work how well you're going to respond with a standard dose, like let's say 250 milligrams that's been studied in the literature, or 600 or whatever. You then have a bigger base to play off, where it's not like, let's just put X dose in and see what happens with estrogen. What side effects happen? Does blood pressure go up? Having your genetics to begin with, you'll know instantly, do I have ACE2 overexpression? Am I going to have to use an A or B prophylactically before I even have to measure my blood pressure? Do I have that risk to consider? Do you have to look at, overexpression of aromatase, so you're planning strategies to mitigate estrogen going up? 5-alpha reductase, androgenic alopecia. Before you even decide to go down this path, genetics, I believe, or pharmacogenetics or genomics, gives you almost like, the cheat codes of how well is this going to go for you based on how your body's responded naturally.
And that's why people should get their data and put it into Prometheus and Genetic Genie like us.
Put into that, and then you've got AI driven softwares. Joe Cohen, I've spoken to him a couple of times at like biohacking events. He owns Self Decode. They have an in-depth platform where their algorithm does a lot of in-depth analysis of SNPs that are constantly being published. So it's like a subscription service that instantly, gives you, like you said, on one side, how well is this going to go from a physique enhancement perspective? What can I sort of expect to happen in my body with this drug interacting? But on the other side, it lets you sort of see, well, let's say you have genetics towards higher ApoB, or you have genetic underexpression of GST or GGT or SOD. These are all enzymes that make, glutathione, superoxide dismutase, your main antioxidant generating enzymes in your body. That if you have an underexpression or these things don't operate as well as they should in your body, that instantly tells you again that your whole strategy of bodybuilding has to be anchored on like reducing oxidative stress or strategies that are going to support your body first and foremost, but then offset the oxidative stress that maybe lifestyle is going to induce, let alone the drugs. I think versus when I first started bodybuilding back in like 2007, 2008 in college, I'm reading, I've made jokes on a post before of like reading men's health magazines, and you're sort of naive to what goes on with some of the things. We're now in an era, I guess, of like there is this open transparency of what people are doing. There's accessibility to the information. There's accessibility to private testing. It's hard to say that it shouldn't be difficult to do performance enhancement like in a relatively risk reduction fashion, given everything that's available to someone. You're not trying to have to learn from experience, like you said, where guys in the 90s were basically, well, if he's taken 4 vials of parabolan, I'm going to do 5. There's and I guess what we're lucky is a lot of these guys who competed back then are slowly opening a little bit towards what practices were done back in the 90s versus what's going on today. And I've spoken to a good few, and in terms of like what people perceive or dosages back then versus what I've seen done in the last 10 years, it's black and white that their level of abuse is quite different to what abuse has evolved in the last 12, 15 years beyond the 90s.
What's the craziest thing you've heard in terms of abuse?
Like 10 plus grams of testosterone.
Ooh,
which
so that's where it came from.
Which
I feel like we knew that.
I for one thing, you sort of applaud, well, where did you find space to inject that volume? But on the other side, like you said, there's a sweet spot. In my view, you have like a spillover. Like when you're trying to carb up for a show, you've got a sweet spot where you're going to have glycogen filled within your muscle tissue without the excess water retention or the spillover. And you're trying to, like, there is no perfect calculation. Anyone asks you, well, what should I eat to carb up for a show? Over time, you'll get to know roughly based on your body weight, well, how much glycogen can I hold, from being flat to full, or based on visual look, X amount of carbohydrates gives me this body weight and this visual look with fluid and electrolytes. You're sort of trying to take that science and then apply it to, a certain way of how am I going to create the most optimal set point without causing a spillover. Where the spillover then is interacting with aromatase, interacting with 5-alpha reductase, oxidative stress, or, quite frankly, just metabolizing the drug and excreting it unused, where like your body then just has no use for it and it'll just excrete it out.
When you're saying glycogen from increasing, have you seen where guys are taking too much gear and then they just look like they're like water bags on stage, but not like water bags because like the estrogen's high or anything like that. It's because they're just so saturated. The muscles are so full. There's so much pressure, but it's like a balloon, right? Like any wrinkles, any details that are within the muscle have just kind of like shallowed out because the muscle's just being so fucking, I don't know, fullized.
I guess you have to view what impacts that, and that it's fluid movement based on electrolyte distribution. And this spillover that I'm talking about, aromatase, 5-alpha reductase, these are all the common or known things that we'd expect drugs to interact with, androgens to interact with. But all steroid molecules can interact or cross interact with other steroid nuclear receptors. So now you've got androgens being able to crosstalk with mineral corticoid receptors or glucocorticoid, where we see this reduction in cortisol expression or cortisol impact. The mineral corticoid interaction is basically going to affect your aldosterone and your sodium retention. More so that like sodium increases, fluid increases within your blood volume. So you have extracellular increase in fluid. Potassium, estradiol change how fluid move into tissue. So normally it's potassium that creates a full muscle in terms of the fluid being held inside the tissue. And then estrogen, one of estrogen's impacts is it changes interstitial fluid distribution of, the space between your skin cells, where that fluid gets distributed between the skin cells themselves. They're, in terms of like dosages, I won't have a dose to say, but this is obviously what you're on about, an interaction of an unwanted interaction that then ruins the look. That quite often with bodybuilding, yes, we want to be full and sort of pumped on stage, but that's also one of the aspects of when you are pumping up prior to getting on stage, you don't want to not like dumb it down, but you don't want to over pump yourself to the point where you lose that detail where you've just basically expanded the muscle and you've lost, detail can matter in some shots that can make you look more impressive. You might look full as anything and you hit a crab most muscular or, hands in front most muscular and you look crazy full. But in other shots, you're losing bits of detail between like your tricep separation or your tricep striations.
That, and you have to adjust this based off the division too, right? Like you look at and I think the most obvious one is just comparing men versus women, for example. Men in classic, men in open bodybuilding, you don't want to most of them don't want to hit their legs, within a week out of show. You also want to pump out your legs, but you look at wellness, you look at bikini, and they're pumping up their glutes and they're pumping up their quads and whatever because they want it full, like with less detail, right? And then I think same can be said, but you kind of have to analyze what your physique looks like and where maybe your physique accentuates special genetics. Like, oh man, like I have like very diced, I don't know, I have very diced arm separation or something. And the judges like this when they hit a side chest. I think that's not something you want to lose if you want to take it, like you want to take advantage of that.
Yep.
Really depends.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, I over time with competing myself, you learn what's sort of like the sweet spot. And I always laugh for guys like pumping up for like 30, 40 minutes prior to get on stage. When I first started competing in my first sort of 2 years, you thought, okay, yeah, I need to make sure I'm properly pumped. You'd spend about 30 minutes getting pumped before you got on stage. The harder you pose and the longer you're out on stage, the quicker you start to, if you know how to pose properly and correctly with, proper isometric posing, you quickly start pumping up on stage where you've got, even coming off stage if you've been posing your legs so hard, the next day it's not, it hasn't been uncommon for me to feel like I've gone through a leg workout.
Yeah.
How intense. I mean,
my left calf is always shot afterwards. Always.
Back in 2022, the second last competitive season, I had Aaron Casely was overseeing my training. Aaron's like an osteopath rehab specialist.
Mm-hmm.
About 3 weeks before the Irish Nationals, I like strained my adductor doing like a back double bicep, where you like twist your hamstring into your adductor.
Yeah.
And that for like 2 weeks prior to that show, my leg training was like goblet squats with like dumbbells and doing RDLs with a kettlebell. He was like, you're going to have to protect that, because it was just obviously being low body fat, hard isometric contractions. You can end up with injuries doing hard posing that people, like you said there with your calf. It's not uncommon when you're on stage, you get a whopper cramp in your calf where you almost don't want to flex your calf when you're doing like back double biceps or rear lat spread, because if I'm going to do it and how dehydrated potentially can be, that is this going to lock and you're sort of limping then for the rest of the day.
Yeah. The dehydration part scares me every time I go on stage. Real quick, guys. So while I was looking at the YouTube analytics, I actually saw that 85% of you guys that watch this channel are not subscribed. And I want to ask very little of you guys, but if you enjoy this podcast, if you find value in it, then please do me this one favor and subscribe to the channel, because doing so helps me get bigger and greater guests like the guests you are listening to today. Also, this channel is not sponsored, which means only the companies that I work with, which are Young LA and Huge Supplements, are the companies that can help fund this channel by you guys using the code NILE. So code NILE gives you a discount of 15% off of Young LA, and code NILE also gives you a discount of 10% off of Huge Supplements. And if you decide to purchase anything from any of these companies, it will help immensely for me by using my code. And this way, I can travel to other guests and also upgrade in equipment to make this podcast bigger and better for you guys. Going off of that, actually, and I'm glad we discussed the glycogen thing, because it's something that's always been fun for me to discuss with like top coaches like Stefan Kienzel and Patrick Tour, because you'll get those comments in like a reel or something saying like, oh man, more gear is better. And these are normally the guys that like on stage with like veins are covering their quad striations and then you can't see the separation. There's a level of too much, because the prettiest physique is the physique that wins, not just the most fucking geared out physique. And I think that's the wrong conception.
Yeah, I mean, but like again, coming back to my own personal experience, Callum Raystrick was, like my prep coach, one of my good friends, and we sort of bounced ideas. I tell him what I thought in terms of like stack setup and whatever. If we knew, in terms of visual, I know from experience how my body responds to something like growth hormone, in terms of that fullness.
Yeah.
That if I want to be as dry and separate as possible on stage, and I have to play everything in advantage of keeping that glucocorticoid activation under control or aldosterone effects. Growth hormone for me, if I wanted to be crazy full, how I sort of look in some of the reels of when I hit most musculars training back then, that's the effect, that sort of bubbly look with growth hormone. Yeah. Is that going to be the most pleasing thing to have when you're doing something like classic bodybuilding or classic physique? Not really, like you said, it looks visually impressive. You hit it in the gym and you look bursting for all veins coming out of your shoulders and biceps. But if that detail on your back or your hamstring glute tie-in disappears from that small little film of fluid, you could lose based on condition, no matter how pretty your physique was. And I always knew my asset was conditioning, and anything that would impair that. But in saying that, there was times where I've done, open bodybuilding in terms of like a weight division, and you wouldn't be sort of hinged off having to take that out. I think 2022, I done the under 90 class of the IFBB Nationals rather than doing classic bodybuilding. And that was one of the shows where, I said to Carl, let's just keep it in. I'd already won Mr. Ireland with PCA in classic bodybuilding. This was just a show I'd sort of committed to, and the run afterwards. So let's just keep it in and bring a much fuller looking physique for, stage photos to keep. But like you said, it's like if you put in these drugs genetically, touching back on it, how the drug distributes from the body or how it's absorbed, how it's metabolized and excreted will then put impacts on the substrates of your body. So in terms of like sulfates, glutathione, how well your filtration of those metabolites is, outputting them from your urine. What's the likelihood of some of these metabolites getting stuck in the body in terms of like in your fat tissue? And this is where historically some guys fail drug tests because metabolites of drugs stay around in the body, and that's because they distribute back into tissues. And so the detection time of those tissues is, 40 to 60 days for some compounds. But it's not uncommon that you could have a failed drug test, a year and a half, 2 years later, if some of that drug has been distributed into tissue, that you lose body fat in terms of the fat cell shrinks, releases its content, and what was stuck inside that fat cell were fat-soluble hormones or hormone metabolites that now you fail a drug test because you done drugs 2 years ago or whatever. You have to bear that in mind, when you're looking at how drugs are metabolized from your body, that there's always potentially a small amount to get stuck, which is, not to put strategies out there, but, maintaining low body fat levels, in theory, staves away some of that potential risk of failing a test in years' time. So, on top of that, I guess just to really briefly touch on it then is your receptor interactions, the genetics that drive that of like the fast or slow metabolizer we covered comes from liver genetics, the CYPs. So that's genetic genie. The other ones, in terms of like genetics, it's very hard to get an accurate picture on your genetics of, I guess, your androgen receptor efficiency. And what we're talking about here are the fingers within the receptor that allow to take the drug, which are like the zinc binding claw. So when people talk about this CAG repeats are what dictate how well you create this binding claw in the androgen receptor. That of itself, you could have an amazing genetic response to drugs in terms of like, let's just say, for example, a slow metabolizer. So you need to take less drugs. They stay in your body longer. In theory, then that achieves a higher therapeutic level when you take an average dose. So let's say 250 milligrams is creating double the expected serum level. But now you've been dealt shorthanded genetics in your CAG repeats, where now your androgen receptors efficiency is quite poor. The only way you might overcome that then, if you think about it, is by putting more drugs in to try and create successful interactions with the receptor. So you almost bully, the probability of an interaction, whereas a normal person doesn't probably have to think about that in terms of the interaction of the molecule to the receptor. So that's where then someone on theory has great drug metabolism genetics, but dynamically they have really poor response where their cells are, if you want to put it in a simple term, androgen resistant, where the receptor's not functioning as well as it could.
Would you have any recommendations on how someone can determine this for themselves?
I think there's a couple of places in Europe that do it. I think there's a lab in Norway, and I think to my knowledge there's a few in the US that do it. There's one guy who's wrote a great book, and a close friend of mine, Thomas Anderson. He has a great post with all of the links of where you can get the CAG repeat testing done. And again, I'll send you his profile and put in the links below. I'm sure he'll be happy. He has a really good anabolic encyclopedia book that he wrote that goes into all the drug profiles. I think Merrick might offer it think Steve was saying before when we discussed on a podcast that they offer a CJG genetic test.
Okay.
And then it's interpreting whether you have shorter or longer repeats.
Gotcha.
How efficient the finger is at docking the hormone into it.
Okay.
With that, you know, again, if you do your pharmacogenomics and you do your CAG repeats and you have all this information, you sort of reduce the risk of then having to think of, oh, well, I'm just going to take 5 grams of gear and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Going off of you discussing your prep and also discussing abuse in the 90s versus now, I think a lot of people can take a lot of value from your own prep and compound uses, even though obviously, as we discussed before, muscularity is a big variable when it comes to like what you're going to dose for yourself. So, you know, I'm sure like what you take and what I take is still a completely different league than the typical top pros. But would you mind sharing your own personal compound choices and uses for your last prep? Because I think out of anyone that I would ask, you'd probably be the most health conscious, I would assume.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that last prep and last time I competed, you were just looking at a physiological base of testosterone. So it was 125 test E.
Mm-hmm.
And then we, prior to sort of committing in my mind to competing, I had 300 milligrams of Primo enantate in sort of for 6 weeks as like a muscle building phase.
Okay.
Bear in mind,
what was your
I
estrogen?
had my estrogen sitting around 90 picomole within UK measurements, which is, I'd say, 20 in US terms. I'm really bad at doing conversion, but we're sort of looking at mid-range basically.
Yeah. So you're someone that like you can titrate up your DHT like Primo to about twice your testosterone base.
Well,
pretty average.
For me, genetically, I have high CYP19A expression. When I was in puberty, I had gyno, like puberty gyno, that was taken care of in my early 20s. And that was, again, when I delved into my genetics, there was the CYP19A expression. And my mother had a history of benign tumors in her breasts that had to be surgically removed. So I knew that genetically aromatase for me is going to be an enemy that I have to consider. An enemy in terms of like keeping it strictly controlled because it's going to impact my physique. It's going to impact my neurochemistry, you know, all these things that estrogen plays into, positive and negative.
Okay.
That 125 sort of served as an anchor that I knew was predictable. And then any change that came from blood work that was predictable based on it was coming from the other things that were going in on top, which was obviously Primo E at 300. To be honest, we ran that started prep the middle of May. I think it was the 14th of May. It was a Monday. I'd just gotten back from vacation. And then the Northern Irish show that I won the overall at, that I think was like the 7th of July. So it was maybe 8 weeks later. When I made the decision to compete in that show, I think we were 7 weeks into prep, and I said it to Cal, and we sort of then thought, okay, well, let's add in a very low dose of tren that we covered before, and that was quite literally 40 milligrams, 10 milligrams prior to training. And I was only training 4 days per week. And then we put in 20 milligrams of Winstrol on those training days as well. So I think total androgen dose for that overall was sub 600 milligrams. I think it was very low.
And how much did you weigh? At what height?
I'm 176 centimeters, so I'm class B for classic physique. And I weighed in for that BPA show. I was just under 90 kilos. I was 89.5 kilos, which I think is like just under 200 pounds.
Okay.
So, and then you can see in the shots, like I'm pretty much down to where I was before, straight glutes, deep condition. After that, the sort of goal, that was just like, let's just enter for the crack. You know, it's an hour and a half drive. I'm pretty much where I want to be for the aim was to do the Two Bros Emerald Cup, which was like 2 days before our family vacation. And how I, you know, approached the prep to my wife was, well, you can't stop me getting in shape for our holidays. But if I decide to compete and keep things, you know, family, work, everything balanced, it's just a holiday diet. That show, after the BPA, I think there was another, so it was July, you had all of July into the start of August. I think about 5 weeks between that show and the actual target show. From that point, after that show, I think we added in 20 milligrams of Anavar on top of the Winstrol, more so from an ergogenic perspective to maintain training intensity, maintain lift intensity.
Mhm.
And bear in mind, my training style since 2022 Aaron was reps and reserve. So the whole thing about volume was as low as you could imagine.
Mhm.
Train intensity, stopping 2 reps in reserve, but like true 2 reps in reserve where I'm getting into these dodgy reps. That, like by the end of it, I think again it was like sub 700 total, taking into account like the Winstrol, Tren, the Anavar, the base of testosterone 125 stayed steady all the way through, and then the 300 Primo stayed the same all the way through. We discussed, me and Steve, 2022's prep. 2022's prep was 300 test, 600 Primo, and 300 Mastron, and then sort of the similar dosages of Tren and Anavar and Winstrol. So, taking that into perspective, that was, nearly, I think, 1,400 milligram total with everything layered in on top of the 300, 600, 300. This time round, there was no Mastron. The testosterone was half. The oral setup and the trend was pretty similar to 2022, which improved me in terms of like cosmetic benefit. The estrogen lowering ability of Primobolan in terms of what it does to the aromatase enzyme expression in theory was enough to keep me looking dried. I didn't need to add in, what you'd classically run with, your test trend mast for a contest prep.
Mm-hmm.
But also showed me, relative to stage weight, 2022, I competed roughly around 88 kilos. And last year I competed roughly at the same weight. My lowest weigh-in was 87 when we really pushed dryness for the final like BPA championships, the like British championships. It just showed me that, I could probably have lowered that Primobolan to around 150 in theory, and probably not seeing any real change performance-wise or cosmetically. 300 was sort of like, I was at 125. I was running 300 for 6 weeks, like an off-season prior to starting prep. That what that sort of was yielding was, okay, well, this is a nice dosage. But again, it shows you that even with all the data that we have, it's still an arbitrary number based on what you're perceiving. Like I said, in hindsight, even looking at the data, 2022 is 600, 2024 is 300, and in theory, could I have gone a bit lower? And we're sort of starting to then see, maybe when we're looking at drug use in prep, people lose sight of the fact that you're using the drugs to maintain muscle mass, not build muscle mass. So the dosages of prep in theory should be way, way lower than where they were in your off season when you're actually trying to enhance muscle protein synthesis. And so that was like last year, that was this sort of aha moment of when I decided I'm gonna prep. I thought, if I'm gonna do this, do I need to go exponentially high with dosages versus where I am heading into the prep? 125 test, 300 300 Primo. Do I need Mastron? Do I need Tren? You then realize, well, when you're making these decisions of, it's prep time, now it means more drugs. That's classic old school thinking of, we're now in prep. Here's our like RIP blend. In the UK, you've got like RIP blend, where in the vial you've got, test prop, mast prop, and tren acetate, which is a classic like old school way of, just take 1 ml of RIP blend every other day heading into a show and you'd be fine. It showed me that when we're looking at prep, we have to be very, objective of, do we need half of the dosages that we've done in the off season heading into prep? Some might argue yes, because obviously you've got a predictable response. You've held a certain body weight, and the goal is to hold as high a body weight as possible whilst reducing the body fat. But on the other side of it, that dosage again could have been just something that you escalated to based on numbers on a piece of paper, like body weight and how you felt in the gym and your progress, that you might be able to take a step back and go, well, maybe we could half that compound and see what happens.
Interesting.
You know, it's one of those ones where when you suggest a lowering of dose, it's almost like blasphemy. No, we should be going the other way.
And I feel like that's very counter to what maybe 90% of the industry believes at the moment, or at least enforces. So I guess what I'd have to ask, just as a devil's advocate, is, I guess, what other data do you feel like you have other than your personal anecdote that it may be potentially true that your prep doses should be lower than your off season? Because I find that most bodybuilders, pro bodybuilders these days, will run a lower off season dose because of just how prolonged that off season is, and to maintain relatively okay markers, I guess. And then as prep rolls around, you know, you're like, okay, I understand that some of these things are not going to be good for, say, my liver or blood markers, other relative blood markers. But, you know, hopefully the cardio and everything else that we're doing is going to help manage that.
So I view it like this, because once you start framing it this way, it sort of makes sense, the viewpoint of less drugs. In a prep setting, you've got a classic stressful scenario. You're eating less food. You're hyper fixated on your performance towards an end goal of getting on stage. And if it's to get a pro card and everything that sort of comes from that personal expectation of achieving that goal, that guys then tend to do excessive cardio, do more than they should, do more working sets or work within the gym, thinking that more work will equal a better outcome. And that's not to say that it's not true, but there comes a point where you have to be very careful of the fine line between driving the accelerator too hard on the expected outcome versus being a little bit more intelligent with how you're approaching fatigue management overall. I hate this bloody word, you know, where guys like, oh, we should manage fatigue. But if you are doing, you know, drop sets and intensifiers and this, that, and the other training beyond like your standard, I don't know, meat and potatoes of maintaining strength within a reputable rep range. Again, I'm not coming in being an exercise expert. I can only speak for what I've done personally and when I helped other guys with some level of coaching. You want to do, you know, as lazy as it is, the most effective volume or the least effective volume that's going to hold that muscle mass in your body. And that's it. And be very strategic in your analysis of, have I done enough in the gym today to maintain chest volume, arm density, blah, blah, whatever, you know, leg. And this all came from Aaron, to be honest, because I was the typical like me head of, you know, I told on the anabolic roundtable the time I nearly cleaved myself in a leg press trying to beat the logbook with 2 weeks out to a show. That
You've all been there.
You know, when Aaron told me about like reps and reserve and, you know, intelligent tempo training and everything, like being still lifting heavy, but lifting smartly, I guess. When we approached that in an off-season perspective, I grew just as well as like going in and doing like top set, back off set. So he'd set like two or three sets in terms of volume for an exercise, 2 to 1 rep in reserve. So never going to that failure rep. And I know, you know, Paul Carter puts out a lot of good content on this. That sort of stopping at 1 rep in reserve, as mentally frustrating in the beginning as it was, where you're like, I should be really getting to the point where I'm grinding out that last rep. 2022's prep, I told him this is cheating. We were 2 weeks out from the first show. I said, this is cheating. I don't even feel tired. My sleep is amazing. You know, my mood. That year I had a lot of expectation on myself that mentally, yes, I was a bit stressed. Taking that same approach into last year, I realized, you know, that fatigue management where you're still lifting heavy and strong, But you're not going to those reps that are going to cause unnecessary fatigue. When you get to that point of unnecessary fatigue, appetite and recovery demands increase. So naturally, you're going to feel more hungry. Your sleep is affected because you're hungry, and there's a recovery aspect in your body where your body's telling you to feed it to recover more.
Yep.
That then enters the scenario where you then bully that recovery by adding in more drugs. I'm going to mask this fatigue and under recovery with more drugs, which is going to let me train better and stronger, but in the long haul is creating more systemic stress, to speak, in that your appetite is still going to be very high, your body's screaming at you to feed it to recover adequately. But now the drugs are making you do more volume with the added mental expectation on top of yourself to do more and be better, that you then start to realize perhaps the increase in dosages during a prep is to mask the mismanagement of fatigue, or being smart in your approach of how you're going to approach training and your fat loss. And that was like the light bulb moment last year where I was like, okay, mitochondrial efficiency, you're able to create more energy density so that there's less oxidative stress. You've higher numbers of mitochondria, feed that adequate glucose to maintain training efficiency. And now you're into a position where actually I probably need less drugs because the system is less stressed. I'm still hitting, this is where I argued in the beginning about like milligram per kilogram dosing, where people are saying, oh, you should take 3 milligrams per kilogram testosterone, and that's sports TRT. And you sort of look and you go, well, we don't have a measure of how much density of androgen receptors you have per kilogram body weight. So that argument eventually fizzles. That you're trying to anticipate where's the sweet spot for recovery in a prep setting. And you'd be surprised, this is, anyone out there that is falling into that trap of more drugs. How about potentially less drugs and understanding fatigue management, looking at how you're training. Is your training truly effective, or is there a biased attachment that you feel under pressure that you have to do more in the gym? And that, and I used to get anxiety, I remember when I was younger, about leg days, because I'd be like looking at the logbook and thinking, how am I getting, 8 reps with 7 plates aside in this hack squat, and you're like 4 weeks out from a show and you're looking and you're going, at this, and to be brutally honest, if I didn't hit it, you'd throw a strop. I competed back then in my late 20s with my wife. You'd be just in such a bad mood that you feel like a failure. You feel like you didn't achieve what you were supposed to based on the logbook.
Or like you're losing muscle or something.
Yeah. And then you're like, well, it's the whole session thrown out. But like you realize it's just one small little thing. And perhaps it's actually telling you, well, actually, Dean, you're quite effed here, in terms of fatigue, sleep, undernutrition or malnutrition, in terms of glycogen and everything else. Perhaps that's a sign to really pay attention how you're training. And but the reverse of it then is don't train like a pussy. But like not to be like too harsh, but reps in reserve, you still have to understand where your limits are and how you train effectively, but you're not going into those depths of despair where you're realizing I've created enough mechanical tension within this muscle to maintain its volume and structure. Move on.
That's why I really appreciate what Chris Tuttle discussed with me regarding training in your prep phase. Because, a lot of us believe, oh shit, like we need to like maintain a level of a volume and stimulus to maintain our muscle mass. But I mean, the fact is that as you're lowering your energy intake, your recovery is going to be hindered too. But the recovery is the most important part. So it's okay to reduce the volume. It's okay to have a lower level of overall volume and stimulus. And that's kind of what you have to do it correctly. So he said, like, I think for Jordan Hutchinson, maybe it was like, I don't remember the exact percentage, but maybe it was around like 75 to 80% of Jordan's like off-season volume he was hitting during prep. And he was recovering fine. He was recovering great. And then you look at him on stage and he looks absolutely phenomenal, which is great because that's proper management. when it comes to bodybuilding. But the one thing I'd have to say is, I think my argument against your point is that I feel like I don't feel like when it comes to the drug intake that we can, even though I do want to press nowadays that lower doses can be used than the past. I think it's still so variable that it'll depend on the person and where they're at, whether or not
Absolutely.
the prep cycles is going to be lower than the off season cycles. Like, I'll see some guys who've built a ton of muscle mass in their off season already. And now they're still building muscle mass at a low rate, but they don't need to titrate up those doses. And one of those examples, I think, for example, is Martin Fitzwater, who's been running 750 test base consistently throughout all his off seasons. Obviously, he has another secondary compound on top of that, which is EQ. But then when it comes to actual prep, it's like, all right, well, now we got to adjust the doses based off of your recovery and how much you're losing. And if you are losing more than we expect, then maybe it is important for us to titrate up this oral a little bit or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, do we have to view it like you're really beautifully explained there is if you don't satisfy the androgen receptors that are being occupied by drugs in terms of like within muscle tissue. So you've got androgen receptors inside your muscle tissue that are being occupied by androgens, which are given the cellular signal for either muscle protein synthesis, nitrogen retention, reducing glucocorticoid expression, etc. I'm not saying that you go in and you slash dosages in terms of like, oh yeah, well, run half during prep. Because even when you look at my prep, it started at 125 and 300. And then there was another edition with Tren and Winstrol. And there's another edition with Anavar. So I'm actually going up in dose relative to where my physique is, where I'm finding, recovery. I'm still performing really well, but I know now I'm at a place where, again, if I was to be truly objective, when Anavar went in with 6 weeks to go prior to the Emerald Cup, did I have to go in based on where my training performance was? Probably not. I probably could have been, let's back off here. But knowing that you're in that fine balance of where the physique was, body fat wise, how training numbers were maintaining, it was just another sort of card to play at that time. But again, patience could have paid off, and we could have went, actually, let's just wait another couple of weeks. And that's sort of, the approach here is, I'm not going to argue that you don't need a lot of drugs for prep, because that would be silly to say, and I've seen it with pro bodybuilders. But for the average amateur, just have it real, base your drug usage off objective data rather than, subjective and emotional of, I'm 10 weeks out from the show, so now I have to add in this compound and I have to increase the dose. You sort of have to look at your physique, look at the numbers, look at your body fat level, look at your output, look at a bigger picture of, does it make sense that compound has to go in? Where's recovery? If you add in more, androgens, COMT expression, slow down the COMT, we now have impacts on sleep, we have impacts on mood. There's a fine balance, and this is why I love that it's so inter-individual in the responses, that my setup and your setup are going to be completely different. You could run what I used last year, and it might actually end up where your physique looks way, way worse. And that's where you can never cookie cutter give a blanket cycle to someone and go, this is what you do. Now, all I will say is just don't be afraid to give yourself time for prep, obviously, but play it on the side of less, maybe more to begin with, and have that option of escalating up if needs be.
I'm totally with that too. Going off of that, actually, I have an experiment to share with you that for this, I did 3 shows for this season. Third show is in it's like tomorrow. Basically, so Patrick Tour, I'm open about just releasing my cycle. Basically, it was a 600 test prop, 600 mass P, Tren, 100 milligrams of Tren Ace. He went to 150, but I hackled him down to 100 just because I do get my night sweats and a little bit of insomnia from it. So I'd prefer just not to have to deal with that. So what's 50 milligrams less of Tren really, you know? And then 50 mgs of Proviron 2 times a day. And then that was basically the cycle. And for me, I was like, holy shit, no orals except for the Proviron, like no actual hard orals. That's kind of surprising because I've always ran orals for all my preps. Even my very first prep that I won my pro card was actually no injectables, just Winstrol and halotestin, which is a long story. But I've never not ran Winstrol before. And obviously we implemented a little Halo in the last couple of weeks, but I just never didn't implement Winstrol. And so I had this discussion with him. He's like, we're going to keep it off. So the first show, we kept it off, and I looked very defined. I was very dry, and my lowest weight was about 179. And then afterwards, from the feedback from the audience, as well as some of the judges, basically I was like the smallest one on stage. I'm 18 pounds below the weight cap. I also looked the least, maybe like full with the least pop compared to the people. And you know, the judges aren't going to say, oh, you look like you took the least gear, but my friends and other people in the audience that I knew are open to telling me that. So they're like, yeah, bro, especially out of the top 5, you definitely look like you were taking probably the least amount of gear out of all of these guys. So I asked Patrick and I confronted him about it. And he was like, yes, that's a fact. You're probably running about half of a normal Olympian stack right now. But slow and steady wins the race. And that's how Patrick likes to roll is, you know, he starts slow with all his clients and then obviously builds up as the relationship builds up as well. So I convinced him to let me experiment with adding Winstrol. And so luckily Winstrol is the only variable, so I can see how it changes. And so we added Winstrol for 3 weeks at the last show at 37.5 mgs a day, which would be 1.5 times with 25 mgs, which means I actually literally like opened up a cap of 25 mgs and split it in half and took that as a second dose each day. And I think that was probably the best look. And that's the interesting thing is like, did it affect my training and my recovery? I really didn't notice hardly a difference, to be honest. But when it came to the actual aesthetics and the actual look, I looked fuller and a little tighter. There were certain parts of, like, for example, glute striations that maybe didn't look quite as deep, but they also didn't look as loose, if that makes sense. Like there was a tighter look to it. And then now for this last show, I upped it to 50 milligrams a day. And now this is going to be 6 weeks on Winstrol. The first 3 weeks was 37.5. The last 3 weeks is 50 milligrams. And my weight at its lowest is probably around 184. When we drop all the injectables and the GH, I would say it's probably closer to about 182. So I've gained probably about like 2 pounds of just water weight in general from being on Winstrol, regardless of how dry and how lean I'm pushing it. And that definitely shows in the pop. But whenever I did up the 50 milligrams, and now that it's been 6 weeks on Winstrol, I'm noticing certain things about my look and my digestion. And my digestion has taken a hit. The GI tract doesn't feel as healthy. I'm having more gas and it's slower. And then also, before I took the Winstrol, people were telling me that I look very healthy. People were telling me my skin looks great. And I was getting that from multiple different people that didn't know each other at different times. And now it's not that people are saying that I don't look good, but I have acne on my chest now and I have acne on my back now. And the water retention in my cheeks is a lot higher than it was before, because before I had just sunken cheeks the entire time. So it's like, I've noticed, I don't know if that's oxidative stress or increase in liver damage, or if that's just like glycogen from the intake of Winstrol, all of these variables. But to me, I would say, man, I think I found like a perfect balance. Like next time I'm probably just going to run 37.5 for 6 weeks. And if I have to do multiple shows, I'm not going to start 6 weeks before my first show. I'm going to make it so that my last show has 6 weeks of Winstrol in it, because at a certain point it starts hurting me.
Yeah. I mean, that's, I discussed this before. Someone asked me about Winstrol. Winstrol, from my perspective, I hate using the phrase cosmetic compound, but like you sort of said, Winstrol, we don't have any data to really say how it works, but we can, from your experience, how I viewed it on my physique, it almost changes how fluid is distributed into your skin cells. It's one of those ones, like you said, when you're very low body fat, when you add it in, there's just this, how your skin changes in terms of like a rougher texture to your skin, but it's the fact that the skin is actually not as hydrated as it normally would be. And you sort of then see very dry striations, especially like around the chest, around your shoulders.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening in your case, potentially, if we look at what happens with orals, is they can potentially interfere with how bile is made within the liver, and then obviously bile is stored in the gallbladder and released from the gallbladder. That a lot of the digestive upset with orals, when you look at mechanisms, when you postulate mechanisms of what ties in, they affect bile, which then has secondary messaging signals towards ghrelin regulation and obviously leptin. That when we have impaired bile flow, it upsets our gut microbiome, because bile is basically what's a lubricant for the digestive tract, moving everything along. Obviously, if we have slow intestinal motility, where food isn't moving as quickly, you will have digestive distress, to speak, where food is being fermented more easily than if it's passing through quicker, which will cause bloating and distension, to speak. That potentially how we sort of try and offset that then is by improving bile viscosity, which is sort of your bile acids, so TUDCA or UDCA, where we need a relatively high concentration of TUDCA and UDCA to support that bile viscosity. And then maybe using synthetic bile like ox bile, which is very identical to humans' own bile. And now what you're doing is you're providing a level of lubricant and emulsification of dietary fats in your digestive tract, whilst also offsetting if your digestion has become more poor, where there's reflux or there's a lack of appetite, where you just don't feel like eating because your stomach just feels off. That those mechanisms of running a relatively clinical dose of TUDCA, 1200 to 1600 milligrams of TUDCA. I don't know if that's in your health setup currently. And ox bile might overcome some of those issues with the bile flow.
I do have TUDCA in the program. What about betaine HCl? How do you feel about that?
So
I know that's more for protein, but
with the stomach acidity, again, it's really important for your overall digestive health, because I guess a really nice way of putting gut health is your stomach is a sterilization tank with acid. Your gut is filled with alkaline, like bicarbonate. So it's still quite low in pH. We're talking like pH 5, pH 6, still below water at 7. But your stomach is designed to kill and sterilize bacteria that could even come from your oral microbiome, from your mouth. Again, your mouth is a pH of 6.5 to 7, so it's neutral in theory. Depending on obviously what you eat, that acidity can change. But you're constantly swallowing saliva that has oral bacteria within it into your stomach. Stomach should have high enough acidity to sterilize and kill that bacteria. If your stomach's acidity, in terms of the hydrogen content of your stomach, which is where the HCl comes from, changes, you're going to see changes potentially in how you digest protein. You need a low enough pH of your stomach to activate pepsin and trypsin to chemically break down proteins. Effectively, if you don't chemically break down proteins properly, you're expecting your gut to pick up the slack. But gut bacteria may then start putrefying, if you want to put it that way. That bad bacteria, I hate that word, but you end up with then obviously with the creation of sulfur gas, depending on the bacteria. It tends to be the metanogens or proteobacteria that produce hydrogen sulfide and methane gas. If your stomach acidity isn't low enough, you're going to see issues with protein digestion. That could be effectively as well slow gut motility, where food doesn't leave your stomach quick enough. Common, things that you might experience with low stomach acidity can be reflux. The way I try and explain it is your stomach has a set volume of like 2.5 liters to 3 liters with gastric juices. When you put food into your stomach, like throwing a load of rocks into a bucket of water, the volume rises of the fluids. Obviously, to accommodate the volume of the food you've eaten in with the fluids. If you've got poor stomach acidity, where the acid level isn't low enough, what potentially you're going to see then is that stomach volume increases and takes a longer time for chyme, for whatever's being chemically mixed around the stomach, to pass into the small intestine. And if that volume increases, now it's touching off the sphincter at your esophagus, giving you the sensation of heartburn because your gastric juice is still acidic. It's just that the volume has increased, that when you have low stomach acidity, it can give you the signs or symptoms of high stomach acidity, too much acid being made. And so you'd have to look at things that are potential signs of low stomach acidity or poor digestion. It's like poor protein digestion or malnutrition, brittle nails, burping. What are other things? I guess excessive gas production, effectively where the food goes into the small intestine where it hasn't been digested chemically properly in the stomach. But also the fact that you could have bacteria from the oral microbiome arriving in the stomach and getting the chance to pass into the small intestine, which is now a more basic pH in line with your mouth, which then can contribute to these bacteria contributing to dysbiosis. The bacteria is in an overgrown state versus where it should be naturally. And so with gut health, people often view, and you've probably had Austin Stout on before. Austin Stout is very clued in with gut and that dysbiosis doesn't necessarily mean that there's pathogenesis, which is disease. Dysbiosis can create a level of discomfort. If that discomfort is linked to pathogenesis, where you have like leaky gut and endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide coming from your normal bacteria into your body because of the like tribal war that's going on with dysbiosis, then you have to go back to like this sequential link of, well, how did this imbalance happen in the first place? And in theory, the stomach is the first sterilization tank. The liver health or gallbladder and bile is like your second sterilization. That the two of them are so critical. When you're looking at digestive discomfort with most bodybuilders, most of it's driven by having low stomach acidity, in my view, that you're then bullying more food in on top of a chemical digestion problem, where the reverse is probably back off on foods, correct the chemical digestion problem, correct if there is dysbiosis. It can be difficult to address naturally. You might need some level of targeted therapy to work with, a functional practitioner or a medical doctor or whatever that can target based on stool testing. Okay, yes, there is a pathogenic bacteria present that is correlating to symptoms. Most people that go through like gut healing protocols that are based on supplements rather than data and, an outcome that's driven by data end up with gut problems where they take supplements like olive leaf extract or oregano oil or whatever, which do have some spectrum of activity to killing bad bacteria. Again, I don't like that word, but bacteria that's causing you discomfort. As soon as you stop using these things, and even antibiotics, if you use antibiotics for SIBO or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, unless you correct the patterns that led to that bacteria getting into your body, which is your sterilization tanks, your bile health, and ultimately your stomach acidity, you're just inviting more of it to be swallowed back in and start growing again. So, every sort of gut strategy has to fix digestive problems and improve the strategy of respecting that acidity of the stomach before you even then think of using whatever herb or antibiotic to address the gut bacteria if needed. So, yeah, I think betaine HCl, what you've got is trimethylglycine or betaine, which is a recycler of homocysteine in the body. So it helps your body convert it back to methionine for methylation. It's useful as well. It's an osmolyte, so it helps with improving electrolyte distribution in your body. What you're doing there is you're taking it for the hydrochloride salt aspect of the betaine. So you're putting HCl directly into the stomach as a salt form to improve the hydrogen content of the stomach. When you look at, the output of stomach acid that you create per day, off the top of my head, it's about 0.15 molar in concentration, which is a relatively, I guess, looking at the acidity of HCl, it's a relatively strong acid molarity. That's sort of the amount of molecules in a liter of fluid molarity, or moles per liter, I should say, without getting into chemistry. With the stomach, from that aspect, when you take betaine HCl, in order to achieve about 5% of the acidity of your stomach with betaine HCl, I'm a bit nerdy, so I do calculations like this. You're looking at between 5 to 10 capsules of betaine HCl to achieve around 0.02 to 0.04 molar of hydrogen, which contributes to acidity. So to contribute to about 5%, 5 to 10% of your stomach's acidity, you're looking at between 5 and 10 capsules of betaine HCl if you've got an issue with stomach acidity. And that's low balling in at the very bottom end of like a 5% adjustment on top of what you should be making daily. The problem with betaine HCl, when you look at it, what you're doing there is you're increasing stomach acidity. That be very careful if you have undiagnosed peptic ulcers or bleeding, you're creating a bigger acid pool, which is going to eat quicker into that ulceration. Yeah. Or if you've got H. pylori, which is a bacteria that does live in a lot of people's guts, if that is the thing that is contributing to the ulceration and more stomach acid being pumped out to allow it to proliferate, you're making that problem much worse. So it's a useful thing if someone does have potential low stomach acid. It could be a strategy they might consider, but being mindful that there is pros and cons, that you don't want to just start taking a load of betaine HCl, because on the other side, betaine, which is the other side of the hydrochloride salt, plays into methylation. So now you could be speeding up methylation or the conversion of methionine to SAMe by putting a big chunk of betaine into your body. So you can get hydrochloride in liquid format. There are certain supplements where you dilute that into water, 5 or 10 drops or whatever, based on the concentration of the product, to try and get some level of acidity into your stomach. The same way people view apple cider vinegar as something that helps with stomach acidity. Useful, but like anything and supplements, it's a double-edged sword. There's pros and cons to it.
You often hear coaches say during prep, for example, or at least you often see them implementing something to keep androgenicity high. So I was wondering if you can explain the benefits to higher androgenicity or an androgen ratio. Like, what is the reasoning behind this?
That is a very good question. I guess when we look at studies that investigate serum balance between testosterone and estrogen, in theory, the ratio that's maintained optimally, or should be maintained optimally within the serum, is approximately 1 estradiol for every 200 testosterones. That's sort of the the estrogen to androgen ratio. I guess when you do that calculation based on serum testosterone and serum estradiol, one flaw of that in an anabolic steroid setting is most of these compounds aren't detectable in bloods. So you're never going to get a serum level of what's tren or what's primobolan or mastron doing to your serum androgen level. The best assumption, in my view, that you can make is, let's say, for example, you're taking 150 milligrams of testosterone, and that is creating an androgen to estrogen ratio in your bloodstream of 200 to 1. Let's just call these arbitrary numbers. My reductionist, so we're going to make assumptions here, is that for every other 150 milligrams of another androgen, you're adding an extra 200 to that ratio. So if you've got 150 primobolan, based on that reductionist calculation, and this isn't strictly correct because you have to view what happens to primobolan when it gets metabolized and interacts in the body, etc. Mm-hmm. But trying to understand how that weighted strategy is happening, you then have to then realize, well, if you've got this balanced ratio of in the bloodstream, because again, inside your cells is a completely different picture, of 200 to 1, adding in another 150 now takes you to 400 to 1, which then as you add more androgens in this sort of androgen balance, you can be heading towards more androgenic side effects. So like this sort of spillover that we talked about, where now the molecule, this is the whole thing around selective androgen receptor modulators. We just want to interact with the androgen receptor inside muscle tissue and disregard every other tissue of the body, whether it's hair, skin, immune cells, whatever. If you now improve that ratio and androgenic side effects start to become apparent, where you're now interacting with skin, hair, etc., that in theory, you've made, again, it's an extrapolated calculation because you can't measure what's in the bloodstream. You're then making the assumption that by doubling that balanced 200 to 1 to 400 to 1, whilst you now are in a more androgen dominant environment, which in theory lowers estrogenic side effects or counteracts some of the effects of estrogen, you're now heading towards more androgenic side effects. Most bodybuilders probably do care about their hair and don't really take care of it until it's too late. And then the other side, they sort of just accept some level of acne as being a consequence of what happens with androgens. Maybe the strategy there is once the androgen side effects start to manifest, that it's sort of a subtle way of telling you that balance is out of control. And by calculating, like I said, your testosterone to estrogen ratio in your serum, you can try and make extrapolations off where your testosterone level is for an X dose and try and mirror or manipulate that value based on the other androgens. It's quite often, someone could be taking TRT, 125 test, testosterone and estrogen on bloods looks good. So that ratio is 200 to 1. But they're not thinking about the extra 300 or 400 milligrams of primo that's stacked in on top of that serum testosterone, that ratio is moving more towards androgenicity than a balanced favorable point. Because again, if we're below 200 to 1, in theory, you're making more estrogen relative to your serum testosterone, which can bring estrogen side effects. So there's a sweet spot, but when you start adding in androgens on top, that androgenic ratio gets very skewed because it's an assumption calculation, and you're trying to use that assumption to correlate to something that is potentially happening physically, hair loss or side effects or whatever.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah.
What way would you view it, or what sort of in the classic way of viewing it? 'Cause I might have a completely different way of viewing it.
No. I think we're pretty on point. But I just always found it interesting that like I made the argument that I wanted to keep the trend low, for example, and he made an argument of adding in another compound or increasing it to a certain dose just to keep the androgen level where he wanted it. And I think that's always interesting to me because when I think about a high androgen level, I'm thinking about a lot of the side effects that are associated.
Yeah, you're thinking of the bigger picture, like it's
I don't really think of the benefits, I guess.
Yeah, you're thinking cautiously of when I put this extra, when we're talking 50 milligrams, when you work out the number of molecules in a certain dosage of a drug based on like molecular weight and the weight of the substance you're ingesting, to put in perspective, 10 milligrams of Anavar is like quintillion, trillion, billion in terms of like molecular number. But like we'd look at 10 milligrams of Anavar and think, oh, that's a very small dose. But it's like it's like 10 to the power of 18. You've got 18 zeros after your number. It's huge. And we tend to dissociate where, like you're saying there, but sure, it's only 50 milligrams of tren. That 50 milligram is, like I said, quintillion, billion, trillion added interactions in your body, whether that's androgen receptor, liver, skin, hair, whatever, brain. You're thinking of it logically of, is that extra 50 milligrams all going to go to my muscle? And that's the strategic way of thinking about it of what's my benefit to risk ratio of these added interactions from this drug dose. And you don't have a predictability. You might have some level of gut instinct that, I'm pretty sweet with where I am now. If we had another 50 milligrams, like you said, now I'm going to have unwanted brain interactions, which are driving catecholamines up, which are going to cause insomnia. That's going to slow down COMT. It's going to affect your estrogen metabolism and affect your methylation and your magnesium stores. And there's a big knock on there that you're thinking of it logically of, well, 50 milligrams on paper sounds like a small number in the grand scheme of when we're talking like grams of gear. But truly, what does that 50 milligrams bring me positive over the other negatives that you're thinking about?
Yeah. If you haven't gotten yourself tested for methylation problems, when would you recommend someone take methylfolate, if any? I'm assuming you would be like, oh, just get tested first. But
I mean, this is where genetic testing, some people, I wouldn't say prey on it, but if you end up with having, let's say, MTHFR genetics, so metal tetrahydrofolate reductase, where you aren't as efficient at creating the required metal aspect to generating methionine. So folate and B12, metal folate and metal B12 play off homocysteine to recycle it back to methionine. So they do a chemical conversion process to recycle homocysteine back to methionine, which then creates SAMe S-adenosyl methionine, which is your metal donor. If you get your genetics tested and you find that you have MTHFR in terms of a poorly functioning MTHFR, so that recycling of homocysteine back to methionine is poor, I don't think you need genetics to tell you that problem. You just check your blood work. Your serum homocysteine will tell you how well are you pushing homocysteine back to methionine. And functionally, the levels of homocysteine that are often recommended for optimal methylation is between 8 and 9. That's sort of the sweet spot. With that, you're then seeing optimal conversion where you have balanced folate and B12 from your nutrition or from supplementation, pushing homocysteine back to methionine if it's in that sort of optimal range of 8 to 9. If you have MTHFR and you don't check homocysteine and you take a load of folate and B12, you could then feed into overmethylation, which has its own problems, versus undermethylation. Overmethylation can play into insomnia, mood disturbance in terms of like volatile mood. It's like any supplement, I wouldn't just chuck in a high dose of metal folate, metal B12, just on the off chance that you could be metal donor deficient, or to improve the efficiency of metallation. A crude way of testing this, and this was something I learned from a seminar from Dr. Ben Lynch, who's a great expert on metallation. Again, people for following. He has basically said that you can sort of test how well your metallation is operating, and that if you take SAM-E prior to bed and it doesn't cause insomnia, so you take SAM-E like 200, 400 milligrams of SAM-E before bed, so let's say 7 p.m., 8 p.m., and you fall asleep no problem, you're probably metal donor deficient. If it goes the other way and causes insomnia, you now have an excess of metal donors, or you're over methylating. That some of the things that deplete metal donors in the body, vitamin B3 or niacin, can help to sort of quench over methylation. That his crude test is you take your SAM-E, and then if you have insomnia, you take a dose of niacin to try and clear out the excess metal donors. But I'd never suggest someone just do crude tests. Yeah, it's useful if you don't have fork out money on a blood test, fair enough. But just check homocysteine, and that way it'll give you an accurate idea. You're going to get your serum folate and B12 on your general blood panel normally. But what's in your blood doesn't necessarily mean what's being used by your tissue. So you have to view the blood is what is in your bloodstream, not as what's inside your cells. Okay. If we have high amounts of homocysteine in your blood, it's came from your cells and that recycling capacity. So you now know, okay, well, I need folate and B12 to improve that recycling. That stands your folate and B12 in serum could look good, but your homocysteine could be above 8 or 9, meaning that you probably could benefit from an increase from your nutrition, whether that's green leafy vegetables, thereof, or using a supplement. Just like I said, with methylation and metal donors, you can hit a point where it causes worse problems than under methylation. Like you go from low mood to actual like mania or aggressiveness or insomnia, that there's a fine balance there. But genetics, it's probably one of the ones, like this is a great point you brought up. Your genetics don't necessarily mean that you've got a problem that you need to fix with MTHFR if your nutrition is satisfying your genetics.
Okay, got it. The motherfucker gene.
Yeah.
All right. Before we go to the Q&A, I just wanted to ask, because I totally forgot earlier, but you said you're mentioning abuse now versus the 90s. What do you see regarding abuse now?
Abuse
or just
now?
Or even just regarding use in general?
I guess maybe it's things are underdosed, but there are, I've seen in terms of like what other coaches have with like clients coming to them using personally before they coach this person, where the person's on like 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams of total androgens and their physique doesn't reflect what that dose should create. Where what they're taking is completely bunk, which can often sometimes be the case. Or there's just this delusion. Yes, we know from Bazin's study that you take testosterone and you're going to see an increase in fat-free mass. I'm not going to say lean tissue, because fat-free mass is how it's accurately calculated. Increase in people who took testosterone and didn't necessarily resistance train. That there's almost this like assumption that like that you take more gear, you're going to get bigger, but not have to do the work. And to be honest, with how accessible information is now and it becoming, openly talked about, like we began the conversation, seeing someone take 2,000 milligrams of testosterone and think, oh, if I take that dose, I'm going to be their size based on what they observe in a social capacity, not realizing that, you know, there's been years of muscular development to get to that person's physique, the routines and habits that play into it and everything else. I guess years ago it was the reverse. It was like, I'm going to take this really high dose because in theory it makes sense. The more I take, the bigger I get. Whereas the other side of it is they're seeing guys use high dosages publicly or discuss publicly and think that that's the acceptable dose that has to be taken to start with. Until a coach tells them, okay, well, perhaps what you're doing here is quite excessive and let's go back to basics.
Yeah, I like Chris Tuttle and Jordan Hutchinson's example of how they titrated it up after a long period of time off, and those low dosages were extremely effective for him. Do you feel like there's what was I going to ask? Like what is a term that you would what is a term that you would use for, I guess, tolerance buildup or like resistance to reaction or benefit of a certain dose? Like I think Kurt uses the word homeostasis, but I don't know. It's an interesting thing to use.
I guess homeostasis would infer like your body's own natural balance, and I'm not going to argue it, you know, with what someone perhaps uses as a definition. I guess when you reach a point of no further return from a drug dosage, in my view, from a pharmacology perspective, you've reached drug dosing saturation. So when drugs are being designed and developed and we're looking at how X drug causes Y effect, you do have empirical dosing, which is basing on body weight. So you dose it in animals and then you go, okay, well, the human equivalent dose from the animal is this. And so you start your clinical trial roughly around your human equivalent dose. If it passes safety clearance for a small, you know, random control trial, what you'll often see is they'll pick that human equivalent dose and then observe the effect. It's not like, oh, this dose is this many molecules, which will fit this many receptors. It's still sort of scaled from the assumption of what we've observed effect-wise, cellularly, from cells to animals and then to humans. You end up with a dose response curve. So you start off low, you see no effect, and you start to see some effect, and that saturation curve keeps going up. At some point, your drug response curve hits a point where you see, I guess, optimal outcome in terms of like balanced interactions where we're interacting with the receptor efficiently to create whatever effect. Let's just say a pain medication. You're seeing a reduction in pain symptoms from X dose. You keep increasing the dose. You're not necessarily increasing the outcome of the symptom. You're now increasing the drug's concentration where it's spilling over into other aspects of the body.
Yeah.
So now you're into saturation, basically. And at that point, saturation, your curve can fall basically into no therapeutic level. So you've got your therapeutic index, which is like a window where you have effect.
Do you mind if I interject real quick?
Yeah.
Do you feel like is that associated though with just if you're on the same dose over a long period of time and then you start reaping less and less benefits?
So if you're doing that, I guess if you're on the same dose for a longer period of time and you're seeing no further benefit in terms of homeostasis, that would infer that your body's metabolism, to speak, has balanced itself to the drug exposure. So you're now seeing no further rate of gain of muscular tissue, if that's the outcome with anabolic steroids, because of a balance in potentially energy in, energy out, which I'm not an expert here, and I'm not going to know the data inside out, but there's a lot of people arguing that you need very little in terms of energy surplus to gain muscle tissue. Is that going to be the optimal rate of gain in terms of like time it takes to gain? I can't. I've got nothing to argue there, so I just listen to what people who are more experts than me on. But if you're on a certain dose for a longer period of time and now it's not yielding a benefit, you then have to realize then, are you at that drug saturation level where the androgen receptors are being occupied maximally, and in order to elicit a change you need either more androgen receptors, so you increase the dose which upregulates the androgen receptor, or you take a break where you reduce the drug exposure, androgen receptor levels have, it's not like insulin where the receptor internalizes off the surface of the cell, but by reducing the dose and the exposure to the compound, further downstream, some of the genetic road stops that could be interfering with gene transcription to cause more muscle mass to be developed, follistatin and whatever else, taking that break might allow that drug to become therapeutic again, if you want to use that word. You've got that therapeutic window where the drug is creating the effect you want. Beneath that therapeutic window, there's no effect, or you're no optimal effect. And above that window, you're into toxicity or unwanted interactions. I'd probably prefer, like, from a drug perspective, that you're at saturation, that you're now at a point where if you put more drugs in, more androgen molecules, you're going to elicit more androgen receptors being made. Does that increase in androgen receptors mean you're going to gain more muscle mass or muscle tissue? In theory, from anecdotal reports and history, in theory it does go up. But then there's all the other things that put a stop on the rate of muscle gain as well. That
I thought the rise in androgen receptors was from the increase in muscle mass over time.
So as you increase, to my knowledge, I've never seen that, but I could be wrong, and I'd be openly happy to read on that. To my view, the increase in androgen receptors that comes from the increase in the drug concentration, which increases the androgen receptor response or the regulation of the protein to create more receptors. The more receptors you create, the more genetic signals you send to the nucleus to increase muscle density. But like you said, the more muscle you gain and the more androgen receptors in theory you have in your body, which then comes back to what we talked about of, whilst I said you might need lower drug concentrations, you still need to be hitting how many androgen receptors inside that muscle to maintain its genetic response. So I think where you hit this balance of diminishing returns, where you're left with a choice of either up the drugs or you take a step back and lower the exposure. It's not that the receptor down regulates. We have enough papers and evidence to suggest this doesn't happen, that the androgen receptor down regulates like an insulin receptor, where insulin receptor becomes desensitized. It's just that everything on top of it, I guess, heavy training, high food volumes, everything else, sometimes it can be a lifestyle that's impacting how you gain muscle mass, where you're not sleeping properly, bile flow, acid health, digestion slows down, that indirectly can come from the drugs themselves, where taking a break naturally resolves some of that roadblock. And now all of a sudden you can eat again, you can sleep, you can recover from training. You might deload where you're pushing your body hard, and that deload from training results in a rebound in PRs or an increase in training intensity because of you've rested the body. I think when you hit that point of diminishing returns, either something is affecting rate of muscle gain genetically, that I don't know the ins and outs from a muscle protein synthesis perspective of what everything that feeds into halting muscle protein synthesis, that it's either something like that or it's environmental that's halting you. Like you've hit drug saturation is basically what I'd be hinging on, rather than the body has gained some level of like balance or symbiotic relationship of balance where the androgens are balancing out metabolism, that the body's just happy to stay where it is. If that was the case, further increasing the dose wouldn't overcome that homeostatic curve, to speak, because balance has been achieved. So your body sort of then sat in a place where it's able to keep things steady. You know, when we're looking at homeostatic levers, you get a temporary shift in one direction, but quite quickly the body brings it back into balance really quickly. Like the kidneys, you can, with fluid manipulation and electrolyte manipulation, you can artificially suppress antidiuretic hormone before a show. But as soon as you sort of reduce those strategies, the body's homeostatic set point is at like 12, 20 hours, that all of a sudden now you're retaining fluid for a while the body balances out from that, that balance. So homeostasis tends to mean that the body comes back to balance very quickly. That doesn't necessarily happen with a high drug concentration, if you want to speak on it strictly that way, but it could be a nice way of explaining something in a more simple fashion. And, drug receptor saturation, or, you've hit the limit on that therapeutic window, if you want to even call it a therapeutic window.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. I truly believe that after talking to all the figures that I've discussed these topics with, the coaches and the athletes, I truly believe that coming off is the right answer. I think in terms of at least being optimal for not just like long-term health, but also long-term overall gains, it just seems to be a better marker. Plus, I've experimented myself with the rebound phase last year, and honestly, I don't think the reward was as good as I thought it was going to be. To be honest, I feel like I actually a greater reward when I took a long health phase and just off of everything for a good long period of time and then jump back on. And I just felt like it was a lot more optimal then. So that's going to be the new.
You have to view what's happening in a health phase. You're reducing drug exposure. So on one side, you are taking some level of molecular stress away from your body, but moving into a health phase, to speak, in terms of how they're normally set up from a coaching perspective, it's normally like lower training intensity. Not that we're fluffing training, but there's lower training intensity. Food tends to fall into either a maintenance or just above maintenance level, where you're eating to appetite, where you're not starving hungry. You're happy with a level of body fat gain, which brings you back to your genetic, there's an example of homeostasis. You have a genetic set point of body fat that your body will naturally try and gravitate back to, where that's, through increased appetite to get you to eat, which over time, the more disciplined you are and the more metabolically flexible you are, you can change that set point. But you're always going to try and gravitate back to that natural, where you're like, whatever, 8 to 10% body fat without throwing numbers out there, but you're eating 3,500 calories. You're in a much more optimal environment from a lifestyle perspective, that everything else just follows beyond there then. So you're not, the reduction in drug dose plays into your lifestyle as well as into your biology as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've been training for over 15 years now, and I was too lazy to track anything training-wise for about the first 10 years, because science-based training's for pussies. But I kept hitting plateaus from burnout, fatigue, joint issues, and injuries, and other factors that at the time I didn't really fully understand, realizing not everyone is built to handle the intense and same workload and injury resilience as Tom Platz and Ronnie Coleman, sad face. I wanted to speed run that shit, but the reality is dudes that have always known their body best are the ones that have been lifting for at least a decade. Shit takes a long ass time to figure out. I started tracking all my training on the Notes app on iPhone because I don't know what paper is. Until recently, I started using the RP Hypertrophy app. The RP Hypertrophy app spoon feeds you step-by-step workouts tailored towards whatever your focus is, or you can customize the workout yourself. Well-educated coaches have always cost $250 to $500 or more a month. I'm paying $500. That's like 10 bottles of testosterone. But if you're not competing or you don't have the money to spend, the app will adjust your program for you every week to maximize your long-term growth. It'll base this on your pump, how fatigued you feel, how your joints feel, and more. It takes in everything into account, none of which I took into account in college because the only accounting I did was counting how many dumpies were in my class. Look, there's a titty. If you don't believe in science-based training, you don't got to do no 3 RIR shit. You can just hoist heavy steel and track it, because we all know that the people who say that they remember their weights, sets, and reps every week are full of shit. IMO, there's a sort of middle ground where you track your progress and make sure all the variables are right in your food, sleep, gear, progressive overload, and then you go to the gym and slam those heavy PRs until your blood pressure is higher than Miley Cyrus. If you're still unsure, they've got a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you still don't like it and it gives you a bad tan, you can get your money back. That way, when you compete at your next show, your tan doesn't cost you the first place that you so well deserve. So go to the link in the description below, or you go to rpstrength.com/Nile and use code Nile at checkout. That's rpstrength.com/Nile, code Nile at checkout. Yeah, I think it was really cool to see Terrence and both Jordan gain so much after they took so much time off of training stimulus and obviously PED stimulus too. So, I mean, it sounds very promising. Plus, just having like, I don't know. World seems to run best when it's run in cycles.
That is true. I mean, going back to the 90s, watching, when I grew up in the era where we watched bodybuilding DVDs that, people shared around, and watching, Kevin Lavrone's Maryland Muscle Machine, whatever it was called. And, Kevin was the classic example of would compete, do Mr. Olympia, do a little bit of tour, and then take 6 months off, 5-6 months off, and then just rebound back into the next Mr. Olympia.
And it's hard to believe some of these numbers that they give 5-6 months off. It's super hard to believe, but it does seem consistent over all the people that do take long breaks that they gain the most mass. It feels so contradictory because you want to just fucking run year round, but I mean, same thing with caffeine and all the other substances we use, right? I will cycle anything that helps well, I guess I'm not cycling enough because it's not working really well right now for peak week, but I will cycle on things that'll help my brain quality and my thought process well. And if I run it every day, it doesn't work. It doesn't. Alpha Brain, caffeine, any of these things, they just, over time, it's it just starts hitting this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So. You don't see the stimulus response being as high as it should. I think,
right.
The other side of the view, I've done this personally back in 2015. I'm trying to remember now years. 2015, I took 4 months off bodybuilding. I don't know, just the monotony of being a bodybuilder for day in, day out for 3 years. I don't know, I couldn't bring myself to go train in the gym. As blasphemous as it is, I maybe trained maybe once a week if I felt like doing it between January and April. And then eventually, the love, when you're doing one session every few weeks, you sort of then start to appreciate training in the gym and appreciate training for what it does for you mentally and physically. That like anything, if you're a rock star and you're touring every week of the year and you're playing multiple shows per week, I'm sure eventually the buzz of playing to a sold out stadium wears off, where the tour fatigue, your performance on stage as a musician wanes off, where they take breaks because they don't want to look at their instruments. And that's why sometimes, I guess looking at very popular bands, it can be years between albums because of the touring demands and then trying to fit writing and recording in a studio when you're already fatigued from such a high performance output. It could be the same, bodybuilding. You're doing this, you're thinking about it all the time. If your goal is to become professional, your daily habits and routines revolve around it. That eventually, your mind could be one of the limiting factors where taking a break away from it gives you that sort of stimulus that when you go back to it, it's more beneficial for you, as paradoxical as you're you're saying.
Yeah. How do you feel about GH timing? Where do you stand on that?
I've always said growth hormone should ideally be timed before bed, in line with how it's prescribed. I guess my viewpoint was, if you're doing it fasted in the morning time before cardio, knowing about the distribution of how growth hormone is absorbed, pharmacokinetic wise, it takes about 1.5 to 2 hours for growth hormone to peak in your body exogenously when you inject it SubQ. It's much, much quicker with IM, although in theory, the argument between IM and SubQ area under the curve of the actual serum level over time is roughly similar between SubQ and IM. With doing it in the morning time, my caveat to that proposition is people are going to wake up, go to their fridge, take 1 unit of growth hormone, let's say, as a very low lipolytic dose, if you want to put it that way, and then go do their cardio fasted within like 20, 30 minutes, drive to their gym or go out to their garage, wherever, and do their cardio. But that lipolytic window from the increase in growth hormone from the injection they've given themselves before the cardio is really only starting to peak in their body about 1.5 hours, 2 hours after they've injected it. So unless you're strategically getting up 2 hours earlier to inject your growth hormone, to go back to bed, to then get up for your cardio when it's peaking in terms of lipolysis, or serum level, because obviously lipolysis doesn't just switch on with growth hormone. I just always viewed growth hormone as being this physiological aid towards recovery. There's no doubt from what we've observed, anecdotally, that changes happen in terms of hyperplasia with satellite cells. The higher your IGF-1 exposure is, not necessarily growth hormone. But if you're taking it all throughout the day in terms of split dosage, then you're I guess coaxing somatostatin to increase in tandem. So you're always going to blunt how your body's releasing its own natural growth hormone. That's fine if you want to commit to a strategy where every few hours you're going to pulse in 2 or 3 units of growth hormone. That's fine. But then you have to view that before you go to bed and you take your dose, your timed dose, you're taking 2 or 3 IUs of growth hormone every 3 or 4 hours, let's say, as one peak is rolling off after about 6 or 7 hours, you're putting in another dose at half the time, basically. When you go to sleep that night, you're relying on what you've injected over what you could capably produce naturally based on your circadian rhythm and your somatotrophs in your body. That there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to commit to that strategy all the time of continuously pulsing growth hormone. Otherwise, somatostatin is going to be blocking your natural output. Viewing it that way, that increase in lipolysis, or that continuous exposure to growth hormone at, let's say, optimal levels. Let's say we're doing 2 or 3 IUs of growth hormone every few hours, which was done in the past as a strategy with insulin. Lipolysis, I think lipolysis is something that is obviously our end goal as bodybuilders getting on stage of releasing fatty acids to fuel our body. The reverse with those chronic fatty acid oxidation can have metabolic effects that impacts our insulin sensitivity due to the increase in fatty acids in our bloodstream, but also affects our mitochondria work and how we utilize glucose in the mitochondria as well. So you're downstream creating some level of glucose resistance or a preference to burn fatty acids, which then can starve cells of glucose utilization, which can cause health problems or can create metabolic problems. My view on it is to use growth hormone prior to bed as a replacement strategy, in that on average you're going to make, depending again genetics, some research suggests on body weight, but again I don't really believe body weight, but this is how it's scaled in dosing with growth hormone and dose response curves, that on average you're making anywhere from like 1.5 IUs up to maybe 4 IUs of growth hormone at night. 4 IUs being like the very top. But also that's then further underlined by your IGF-1 score and your Z score of where you fall in the population's level. So obviously IGF-1, we can measure IGF-1, we can get a relative understanding of what conversion process is happening from the GH you've taken exogenously. But it's more important to sort of see, well, where was my initial baseline IGF and where has it moved to with whatever dose in terms of therapy? Yeah, and what you're looking for is your Z score to go up. Anything above 2 in terms of like standard deviation of where you are versus the population is considered super physiological IGF. If you're doing it before bed, you're understanding that it takes 3 to 4 hours to peak in your system. And this is where it's prescribed for people who have cachexia or muscle wastage with AIDS. You're understanding that you dose before bed, knowing that 3 to 4 hours into sleep, you're getting this big maximal peak of growth hormone. With that, you have the opportunity, based on circadian rhythm, as the drug level is peaking from the injection, to still produce some growth hormone from your circadian output. Because there shouldn't be anything limiting somatostatin. Maybe ghrelin impacts from the food you've eaten and your nutrition. But you have this window of maybe the first hour and a half of your deep sleep, which is obviously your most physically restorative part of sleep, which we think, before we move into the later stages of REM and light sleep, that you're getting your body's own natural production of growth hormone and then adding the injected growth hormone on top. So you're getting like a 1+1 effect. You've got your own body's natural production, and then you're getting a peak from whatever dose you choose to use with growth hormone. And then as you wake up the next morning, because of the clearance profile based on circadian rhythm, what you've injected starts to clear as you wake up. So the lipolysis that's happened in your sleep from the increase in growth hormone is now starting to roll off into daytime when you're more active. You've got muscular contractions influencing insulin sensitivity and glucose transport, that you're not creating this sort of blurred signal, I guess, of excessive lipolysis because of the increased growth hormone level in your body. It doesn't mean that dosing it multiple times throughout the day or doing IM injections, which some people, argue in theory against. When you look at the research, the whole point of a SubQ versus IM injection was compliance. Growth hormone deficiency is in pediatric populations, in children. It's a little bit easier to, compliance-wise, administer a SubQ injection to either thigh muscle with a very short needle gauge or to the abdomen than it is getting a deeper needle and injecting it into muscle. There's a lot more trauma And to be honest, if you want this child to take this medication to proliferate bone tissue and whatever to grow to proper stature, they have to take this medication for a long period of time. Any sort of deviation to compliance becomes a negative. So whilst IM, when you look at the data, results in a higher peak but a shorter window, when you view it versus SubQ, you get a slower peak, a lower peak, I should say, but a slower distribution. That the area under the curve, when you draw a dose response curve, you do IM, you get a big peak and then you come down. So you have this shaded area where the peak goes up really high but drops down really quick. If you do SubQ, you get this smaller peak, but it's over hours upon hours. So when we shade in the area underneath the curve, it's relatively similar between IM and SubQ. So IM generates a big, massive peak, a higher serum level, but rolls off quicker.
Yeah.
SubQ creates a lower serum level, but it's over a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. So some of the arguments are basically that you get a higher serum level with IM with whatever dose you choose. Let's put 4 IUs versus 4 IUs SubQ. Yes, you're getting a higher serum level of growth hormone from the IM injection. Does that serum level mean more growth hormone receptor interactions versus the lower serum level over a longer period of time? You then have to then classically look at, well, what's the IGF that's being yielded directly from that area under the curve? And when we look at the area under the curve towards drug response, they're relatively the same. So it then comes back to, like I said, you get a big peak for IM, which is one of the arguments, which is valid. You get a big serum level, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a higher IGF-1 serum level, and that's more appropriate than a lower serum IGF-1 level over a longer period of time. I'm not an expert in terms of the kinetics when it comes to IGF-1, but having a higher level of IGF-1 can invite then more binding proteins to be made, which then reduces the bioavailability of the IGF-1. Having a lower peak level, but a longer exposure could increase binding protein levels as well, reducing the bioavailability. I think there's just two camps. I don't sit in either one of them of, you have to IM or you have to SubQ. You have to do it before bed. You have to do it, before fasted cardio. I think looking at logically what happens when you take the drug, you have to then think, well, what am I gaining? Like what we talked about, the 50 milligrams of extra tren. If I do that GH, IM in the morning before my fasted cardio, but I specifically on purpose do it about an hour and a half before that fasted cardio. So I'm going to fast for an hour and a half, let that big peak level happen. Is that peak in GH and the lipolysis that's induced from that high growth hormone level going to directly mean that over that 24-hour period you're oxidizing more fatty acids versus not doing it until you go to bed that night? I don't think there's arguments for and against either, but in my view, based on how it's been administered to patients who need it as a therapy, it's always been before bed. Based on IM, it creates a higher peak level, but it's too quick acting. When it's done SubQ, it mirrors the circadian output of growth hormone, of how it's produced, peak nighttime, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., whenever, and then rolls off before you wake up. That SubQ is designed to mirror how you make it naturally. And it just made sense that then if you're going to utilize it, do it as a replacement, whereby if your deep sleep is affected for whatever reason, where you're a very light sleeper, you've got kids, you've got a stressful job that you don't get proper deep sleep, or your sleep is very fragmented, you have undiagnosed apneas, you're using it as like a strategy to ensure that you have an optimal growth hormone level during your sleep for cellular repair and everything that growth hormone plays into. So I don't think either argument is wrong. It's just thinking logically, well, what happens to the drug when it's done either way?
Do you believe Kurt's research that IM, there's 30% less growth hormone absorbed?
I have never seen that paper, to be fully honest. Again, I'm not going to argue what someone says. But in terms of a inflammatory response that comes from growth hormone injected into the muscle, in theory, I guess looking at how growth hormone is constituted, it's an aqueous solution. So residency time of something that is aqueous, let's say we do inject it into a muscle cell, into muscle tissue and into the muscle cell, not even like, we have to be very careful in how we view what's being spoken at here, because injecting something into a muscle, in theory, and this is abstract thinking, even though you've gone into the actual muscle tissue, you're going to have spaces between cells. So in theory, you might not put the needle. And so what I'm trying to get people to visualize here is piercing straight into a muscle cell itself, rather than the space around muscle cells. I have not seen research that argues that it doesn't occur, so I can't argue or refute. And having absence of evidence doesn't mean that it doesn't occur. We have to, if there is some place where it's come from, just because I can't find evidence of it doesn't mean it can't occur. Similarly, we should have evidence to support if it does occur. But if something is injected into a cell specifically, like growth hormone, and it's inside the cytoplasm of that cell, this is what, again, I want you to think about. I'd just see it potentially just leaving the cell because it has nothing to interact with inside the cell. The growth hormone receptor is on the surface. So I'm not going to go against, if it does occur, maybe that's why you see potential responses. But like I said, between IM and SubQ, when you look at the area under the curve between the two administration methods, the area under the curve is relatively the same, which tells us that the availability or the release of the drug in both cases, the concentration, the total concentration delivered is the same.
Okay.
It's just IM delivers it quicker and higher versus SubQ.
Gotcha. Okay. What about GH post-workout to increase hypertrophy?
Again, when you inject it, let's say you inject it locally, that's not to say there's not growth hormone receptors within like your biceps, but really what's causing the hyperplasia we know is IGF-1, like local IGF-1 production from mechanical tension, and then global IGF-1 conversion from the liver. If you do it, post-workout, and you inject intramuscularly into, say, a body part you want to grow, let's say your biceps, you want bigger biceps, does that increase in growth hormone concentration locally, does that occur? Again, we have to view that an intramuscular injection peaks much quicker than a SubQ, which means it peaks in serum, not peaks locally. So peaks in serum mean that your whole body has an increase in growth hormone level.
Which isn't necessarily
going to contribute to an increase in growth from the bicep that you've trained.
Yeah.
Does that stand to something like recombinant IGF-1 or, IGF-1 L or 3 or IGF-1 DES? Perhaps there's some strategy there of injecting locally into the site that has been trained, that has seen an increase in IGF-1 expression from mechanical tension. But again, it's a water-based compound which will go into serum very quick once injected, which then goes to other parts of the body. So what you're trying to catch there, it's like anecdotally, BPC 157, TB 500 were always told to be injected at the site of injury, like injected as close as you can to that torn tendon or ligament. Not something you want to be telling someone who's had like a tendinograph operation of like having tendon reattached or whatever to start sticking needles in close to the injury site to get it to repair. It's water based, so it diffuses, and then it diffuses into circulation, into systemic circulation. So anything that's water-based injection-wise is going to move through tissues very quickly. You know, things that are lipophilic, you know, fat-loving, like steroid oils, they're going to pass much slower because they're getting held. Their distribution or their affinity to stay in the tissue is much higher. So when you've got water-based compounds, even trying to time it around like training to improve a body part, eventually it's going into systemic circulation. Some of it's going to act locally. So yeah, if you inject BPC 157 into an injured tendon, you're going to get interactions of that peptide locally as it diffuses from where you've injected it. But surely enough, all of those molecules head out into the bloodstream and just get distributed everywhere.
Yeah.
That it's probably easier to put something like that into SubQ from a compliance perspective. Again, you don't want to be telling someone with surgery, start sticking needles in where you've had surgery. Put it into somewhere that allows them to take it daily without objection is a better strategy long term. Again, you're not causing trauma locally. So yeah, I think any sort of strategy in the past of like timed use, maybe Increlex or IGF-1 DES locally straight after you've trained, you can see some logic to it. But I just don't think, you know, that how we're viewing it and how the molecule would move into distribution, that you're getting any local benefit. But that's not to say increasing IGF-1 from an injection of IGF-1 isn't going to yield benefit, because it certainly would.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Gotcha. Well, I feel freaking terrible because I need to get my meal in because it's peak week now. And I'm sure that it's really late for you considering that we start at like 8 p.m. your time. But I don't know. If you're up for it in the future, we got a lot of questions for you as normal because everyone always wants to know things from Dr. Dean. But a bunch of stuff about like mitochondrial supports and kidney health and other organ health and management. So I don't know. If you're ever up to coming on the podcast again, say in the next couple months or so, I think that'd be freaking awesome.
Absolutely. I'm sure that question list probably just gets longer and longer from podcast to podcast. So yeah, maybe next one we just go straight into Q&A rather than tangents on digestive health and everything else. I'd be happy to do that. Yeah,
that'd be awesome, man. Because I'm sure we can expound on it even further and just keep going on other topics that are very related. So thanks for coming on, brother. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
That was amazing. And I think that was so much information and value that it's always new for everyone. So everyone's always very happy to hear from you.
Yeah, I'm delighted that there's such a demand. I'm always happy to come on and have great conversations with you, Niall. So yeah, let's do more in future.
Hell yeah. Thank you, brother. Is there anywhere that you would like to share with the audience, maybe anywhere they can find you or anything you'd like to promote?
I guess Instagram, DNSTM is my Instagram that I've shared before. Supplement Needs is our company in the UK, so supplementneeds.co.uk. Unfortunately, I have gotten a lot of flack from US followers. We've had to stop shipping to the US for the time being with customs and everything, which has been something I'm trying to overcome. So apologies there. But anyone who's, you know, on the European side, they can check out our website.
Hell yeah. All right, bet. And I don't know if the answers changed since the last few podcasts that we had, but if you were to disappear from the world tomorrow and you had one message you could send to the entire world today, what would the message be?
I think it'll stay the same. I think forever it's always going to be protect your future health. Always, like, I'm so pleased with today's conversation of when it's sort of like, oh, well, let's put 50 milligrams of tren in. You're thinking, what negatives are going to happen here rather than, oh, more drugs means more success. So
Yeah.
every little, I can't remember who said it in terms of like who's originally quoted with saying it, so apologies, but I read before that every step you take is either going to lead you towards ease or towards disease. So that, I think, is a brilliant quote of just every little small action you take daily plays into the bigger picture that sometimes you might not see it. And like I said, with the hospital and the guys there with critical illness, it just anchors you back into the presence of taking care of yourself as a priority from a longevity perspective pays off in the long run.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you.
That was awesome,
Speak
brother.
to you soon.
Yeah, hope you get some rest tonight.
You too.
Later,
Enjoy your
Dr. Dean.
meal. Bye.